Dr. Shelton, to me, offers an answer to hygienic science for today and a promise for better hygiene tomorrow through all his works and literature that he's offering today. And now this is the rarest, most flattering task I've ever had to undergo, and it's not a task, it's a very great pleasure. I would like to introduce to you the Dean of Natural Hygiene, Dr. Shelton.
While listening to his introduction, I thought of a joke, and I'm going to tell it, and it has no personal reference. In other words, it's not a reflection on the young man who introduced me. The story is that a man was introducing a doctor at a meeting, and he said, I want to introduce to you a doctor. I don't know what kind of a doctor he is. He is not a medical man. He is not a chiropractor, but he's some kind of a doctor. Anyhow, I give you Dr. Jones. So Dr. Jones arose and he said, yes, I am a doctor. I'm a veterinarian. And this is the first time I have ever been introduced by one of my patients. That makes a good introduction from the talk this evening. I don't know who chose that title for me. Drugs, disease, and doctors. They don't really have any connection with each other. The word doctor is from the Latin meaning teacher. It is synonymous with teacher or professor or master. And I think whoever fixed up that title had in mind physician. Now, a physician is one who is learned in or skilled in the art of drugging. That is the literal meaning of the word physician. And it would have been better had the title been drugs and physicians. Leave out the word disease because, well, while they're disease treaters and treated with their drugs, they really don't know anything about it, and they admit that they don't. So instead of spending our time this evening discussing physicians, and I could spend a month on it without exhausting the subject, without spending our time discussing drugs, and the world has been discussing them for 2,500 years and it's still at it, and about the only conclusion we can come to with reference to them after all the talk and all the experiment is that without exception they're all poisonous, and that none of them have any business in the human body under any circumstance or condition of life. They're all disease-producing. They're all death-dealing. And that sums up our experience, 2,500 years experience with. Of course, we're always seeking for new drugs in the hope that we can find one that is sufficiently toxic to kill or destroy or drive out the disease, but at the same time sufficiently non-toxic not to kill the patient. The ideal drug. There isn't any such thing as an ideal drug, but to search for it. Now, the original idea was, as expressed in the old Latin aphorism, ubi, virus, ibi, virtus. Translated into English, that means where there is poison, there is virtue. The word virus there is virus. You're very well acquainted with it in the English pronunciation of virus. The word virus in Latin, in Greek, in French, in Sanskrit, and in English means poison. Within recent years, the word has been appropriated by the medical profession and applied to a submicroscopic form of life that is supposed to take the place of germs in the diseases in which they couldn't find any germs to cause the disease. Instead of calling it a poison, or instead of giving it a name of an organism, they called it by a name which means poison, which is by no means a way of clarifying a subject. But instead of going into all this, drugging, killing with drugs, making people sick with drugs, prolonging their illness, giving them symptoms that nature never produces in simple diseases, cutting short their lives, let us think of our own selves and of something that let us talk about something that we can take home with us new. I like to have things that I can get my teeth into. Something that, for example, that we can make bricks with. This afternoon I talked to you about means of recovery, the ways of recovery. And this evening, suppose we discuss for you a few of the conditions from which you want to recover, or should want to recover, if you are suffering with these particular conditions. And I'm going to begin with a condition that is supposed to be very common. Not merely very common, but also very dangerous. That is simple constipation. I'll begin with that. Now, why should I begin with constipation? Well, to begin with, it is a simple functional failure. You would think that if anywhere in the world, after 2,500 years of effort, a remedy had been found for anything, it would be in some such simple condition as constipation. Yet all of you know that you can take all of the pills, all of the constipation cures, all of the herb teas, all of the wheat bran, all of the agar-agar, all of the mineral oils, all of the rectal dilators, and all of the other means that are employed, the enemas and the colonic irrigations, to force bowel action. And you can continue on year after year suffering with constipation, and in most cases growing progressively worse. In 1922, one of the Mayos made the prediction that within 2 years, remember now that was 40 years ago, within 2 years they would have a cure for cancer. Recently, a cancer research team discussing the same thing said they think they will have a cure for cancer before the end of this century. And that is quite a difference between that and finding a cure for cancer in 2 years. Now, why did I bring cancer in this? Because I want to point out to you that the way to accomplish anything is to begin at the beginning. The only thing in this world that you can get into from the top is a hole. And that's where they are. They're starting at the wrong end of pathology in searching for a remedy. Instead of starting with the initial beginnings, they start at the end points. So they're going to have a cure for cancer soon, but they can't remedy constipation. They can't remedy pimples on a girl's face. They can't remedy simple indigestion. They don't even know the cause nor the remedy for blackhead, but they're going to remedy cancer within a short time. You didn't learn art that way if you're an artist. You started at the beginning, and you worked up from the simple to the complex. You started the same way with mathematics. You started the same way with music. You started the same way with any other subject that you studied and that you may have mastered. You began at the beginning, and you worked up gradually to more and more complex material until finally you had mastered your subject. They begin at the top and try to work down. find a cure for cancer first, and then after that we'll get a remedy for constipation. I begin with constipation because it is one of the first symptoms that shows up in us. Of course, if we begin in infancy, it may be a simple sniffle that the child first develops, or it may be constipation, or it may be colic, or it may be hives, or it may be indigestion or gastritis. Some simple something is the first stage or step in the evolution of formidable pathology that may not complete its evolution until middle age or after. We need to understand that these formidable diseases that are referred to as degenerative diseases of later life belong to later life only because it takes a long time to complete their evolution. Hardening of the arteries, heart disease, diabetes, Bright's disease, apoplexy, cancer. These things come in later life because it takes time to break down the human organism. And the initial evidences of the beginning of that breaking down process are the simple conditions that we develop early. Constipation, indigestion, skin rashes, various other minor troubles, a little pain here, a little ache there, that is evanescent. You get up in the morning with a dull frontal headache. You stir around for a bit and get a little fresh air, and it passes away. You think, oh, there's nothing to it. It doesn't mean anything. It means that you are already breaking down. It means that the body is already laboring under a burden. It means that you're already toxemic at whatever age it starts. And if we can once grasp the fact that disease is an evolutionary process, that it begins with small, simple beginnings and progresses stage by stage and step by step to formidable endings in middle life or after and sometimes before, then we can understand that in order to get well and in order to remain well, we have got to think of the causes of those beginnings, the initial causes, the producing causes that start the trouble and that maintain that trouble and make it worse as we go along are the things that we must think of. Now, constipation is to begin with, a simple functional failure. The colon is simply tired, it is fatigued, it is enervated. But it is a part of the general innervation of the body. You take a trip. You go by car, you go by train, you go by plane. I have it happen almost every day in my institution. They come in from long distances by car, by train, by plane, and they say, I'm not usually constipated, but I haven't had a movement on this trip. They want an enema right away. Can I have an enema? I say no. But I've been eating and I've got all that material in me. You know, that's an expression of the popular idea that the chief purpose of life is to be filling up all the time and emptying out again. They've got it in them. Now actually, they digested it. And it passed into the bloodstream, and washing it out with an enema doesn't do any good. As a matter of fact, you can't do it. So I tell them, you just relax. You rest a while. And your bowels will move if there's a need for a movement, and they do. Now here we have a functional failure due to the fact that they're tense and they're fatigued, and they rest and the bowels move. Or we could give them an enema, and then that would weaken the bowels still more, and it would be 3 or 4 days before they'd have a movement, except the one that the enema forced. And you can keep on taking enemas, and you can continue taking it until you reach the point after a while where even the enema doesn't occasion a bowel move. I've seen cases where they take an enema this morning at 8 o'clock, and they would pass the water tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. It would take 24 hours for them to have a bowel move following an enema. This was the result of continually taking enemas. I've known of cases where they've taken drugs until they've produced conditions that are hopeless. They have produced fallen stomachs, fallen colons, pockets in the colon, ulcers of the colon, even cancer of the colon as a consequence of constantly irritating the colon with poisonous drugs. Now, I'm not absolutely sure of this, but I feel reasonably certain that the taking of mineral oil frequently causes ulcers and even cancer of the intestine and colon and of the stomach. We do these things because we have been taught that the way to get rid of a trouble is to force action rather than to remove causes. Force bowel action. We're always trying to do the thing for ourselves that we should permit our organs to do, and we should let them alone and let them do it in their own way. I remember a story that Dr. Stanford Kingsley Clonch, a good friend of mine, used to tell in his lectures. He had an office practice in San Francisco, and he also had a raw food restaurant in San Francisco. And he used to have his breakfast with his family in the morning, go down to his office, have his noon meal at his restaurant, and then have his evening meal again with his family in the evening. One day a man came to him and he said, "Dr. Clonch, I've been constipated for so many years. I have a very bad case of constipation. I've used drugs, I've used everything in the drugstore. I've tried chiropractic, I've tried everything I ever heard of, I've even tried Christian Science. And now I've come to you as a last resort. If you can't help me, I guess there's nothing that can be done for me." So Dr. Clonch examined him and got a case history. Finally he said, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll take your case for $50 paid in advance, and I'll take care of you until you are free of constipation." The man paid him the $50. He said, "Now here is my prescription. You go home, and if you dare have a bowel movement before next Tuesday, I'm not going to have anything more to do with you, and I'm not going to refund any money." Three days later, Dr. Clonch was sitting in his restaurant having his noon meal when this man came in, and he came over to his table and he had his hat in his hand and his head down rather sheepishly. He said, "Dr. Clonch, I'm very sorry, but I just couldn't hold it any longer." If only we could learn to let our organs carry out their own functions and stop trying to function for them, they'll do a splendid job. But we've been taught to meddle with the functions of life. And we meddle, and we meddle, and we meddle. And we think we're doing ourselves good. I was called once to see a young woman in Jersey City. That's a suburb of New York, as you know. The husband came to get me, and as we went along together, he gave me the full story of her troubles. Her mother developed abscesses in her breast when the girl was born. As a consequence, she didn't nurse the baby. The baby was put on a formula. Well, formula-fed babies are all constipated. So they gave it the big milk of magnesia. Well, drugs occasion action for a time. Then you've got to change to another drug to get the same action. You've got to first increase the size of the dose and the frequency of the dose, and then after a while you change to another drug and you go through the same process again. And then you change to another drug and you go through the same process again. So this was done in this case until the young woman got married and her husband stopped her from taking drugs and started her using enemas. But then the time came when the enemas didn't work. So he took her to a naturopath in New York City, and he took her off the enemas and put her on mineral oil. She had used mineral oil for a few months, and then the mineral oil ceased to occasion a bowel action, and the poor woman waited 3 days, and then she took some Epsom salts, and she waited a day, and she took some more Epsom salts, And then she waited a couple more days, and I was sent for. Well, I got there, and I found a woman with a light fever. She wasn't feeling very good. She was in bed. She had a coated tongue. She had a little distress, but no severe pain. So I sat down by her bedside and talked with her a few minutes, got her story. Finally, I said, now I want you to stay in this bed and not take anything but water until I tell you what to take. She says, I'm not hungry. I have no desire for food. I said, I want you to stay here and rest. I don't even feel like getting out of bed. Well, all right. She was just in the condition that she was ready to do what I told her to do because she couldn't very well do anything else. You know, in this particular, she reminds me of people who come into my place with a whole page of stuff typed out by their physician of the foods that they're allergic to. They're allergic to so many foods that I look over the list and I say, well, there's only one thing you can do now. Let's go on a fast. There's nothing left for you to eat. Well, at any rate, I prepared to leave, and I got almost to the door of the apartment when she said, Dr. Shelton, aren't you going to do anything to make my bowels move? So I turned back and I said, your trouble is that your bowels have been made to move too much already. If you had meddled with your heart half as much as you have meddled with your bowels, you would have been dead a long time ago. Now let's let those bowels alone. On the 13th day, her bowels moved. Within 2 weeks, she was having 2 free and easy movements a day without any forcing measures whatsoever. And I didn't do a thing. In other words, we did nothing intelligently. I didn't give her any cures. I didn't give her any treatments. I just let her rest physically and physiologically. And then I put her on a reasonably good diet and gave her some daily exercise. Well, it's as simple as that. You see a man sitting in the audience. I'm not going to point him out to you now. But he came down to my place about 3 years ago, or maybe it was 2 years ago, with an ulcer of the stomach. As my memory recalls, he said that he had had ulcers of the stomach for 15 years. Now that's long enough. Don't you think? I'm sure he had had all the treatments, all the drugs. There's one thing he had missed, thanks to his good intelligence. He hadn't been operated on. Maybe they hadn't cured him often enough. The rule for operations for gastric ulcers is that operate after the patient has been cured 9 times. Maybe he'd only been cured 7. At any rate, you know the way they treat ulcers. They put them on these sippy diets and bland diets, and they feed them at frequent times during the day and at night, because the gastric juice getting into the stomach is supposed to irritate and even digest the stomach walls. So they have to put food in there to use up the gastric juice and to relieve the patient from his pain. And I reverse the process. I mean, in that way you don't get well. So you take anodynes, and you take tranquilizers, and you take drugs that are supposed to coat your stomach, and so on. Even sometimes you take digestion. But you don't get well. You just keep palliating symptoms. And one fine day you have a perforation and they rush you off to the hospital because of peritonitis. Well, we put them on a fast. Commonly they have a little more pain for the first 3 days and sometimes for 4 days. Then the pain begins to lessen, and day by day it gets less and less and less, with occasionally a morning when they feel a little worse. And then there comes a fine morning when they wake up and they say, well, I have no pain at all this morning. Well, they're almost well, but they're not well yet. This is a good start towards recovery. I've had cases of ulcers that have had the ulcer for as much as 20 years to recover, and within a short time. And they don't have, so long as they take care of themselves, they don't have recurrency. I've got one man that came to me for a gastric ulcer in the early part of World War II. He was in the Army. He was in the medical corps. He was helping him dish out the sulfonamides that they were so free handing out in those days. He said to me, we get a new sulfa drug every week to test out. And before we get it tested out, we've got a new one to test out. They just kept flooding the Army with sulfa drugs. As a matter of fact, the boys in the Army are guinea pigs for the medical profession. They still are. Well, at any rate, he developed an ulcer of the stomach. So they simply discharged him. They said, we can't do anything for a stomach ulcer. Get out of the Army. He was happy enough. So he came down and recovered in a short time, a few weeks, from his ulcer of the stomach, and he's been free of ulcers since that time. In other words, if you take proper care of yourself, once you get well of ulcers, you don't have to have a recurrence. But it is necessary. It is absolutely necessary that you do take proper care of yourself. You're in the same boat with a man who has been a drunkard and who has broken down his health and who finally decides that he'll give up drinking. So he gives up drinking and he goes out and he lives out on the farm and he works outdoors and he builds himself up into a state of good health. Then he comes back home and he enjoys health for a time, then he decides, well, I'd like to drink again. What do you think happens to him when he goes back to drinking? He develops the same old troubles again. In other words, when you return to the habits of living that produced your trouble in the first place, they will produce the trouble all over again. And they'll do it in less time the second time than they did the first, because you never regain. Once you have broken down your resistance, you never regain that original resistance. You get into a fine state of health, still don't have the resistance you started life with. Therefore, it's wise not to break it down to begin with. You remember the story, I believe it was Jesus who told the story in the Bible, and this is an appropriate day to mention it because it's Easter. I don't know what Easter has to do with Jesus, but anyhow, originally it was dedicated to the goddess of spring. But at any rate, he told the story about a sow that was washed and then returned to her wallowing in the mire. You know what happened to the old sow? She got dirty again and needed another bath. Now that's what happens to the person who gets well and then goes back to the mode of living that produced the trouble to begin with. He simply gets dirty on the inside and he needs another cleaning out. He gets sick again. And he needs another period of recuperation and restoration in order that he may regain health. It is so much simpler to stay well after you get well. It is so much simpler to stay well before you get sick. I'd far rather care for, educate, I should say, a group of young people into ways and means of preserving their health and avoiding illness than to run a repair shop where every old broken down jalopy that comes along has to come in for repairs. How much more important it is to stay well while we are well. Let's take another simple condition besides constipation now. Let's take a cold. You take it, I don't want it. I used to hear people say, I'm catching more cold every minute. What they really meant, only they didn't know what they meant, was that their symptoms were going a little worse. They were sneezing more. Their nose was running more. Their throat was becoming a little more irritated and raw. They weren't catching anything. As a matter of fact, they were getting rid of something. And it was a little too hot and feverish to justify calling it a cold. Think of all this stuff that was leaking out through the mucous membranes of the mouth and nose. And they said they were catching it. They didn't catch it, except in the same sense that a dog catches it when you toss a bone at him, they had been overeating, and they had been enervating themselves so that their elimination was impaired. And they had developed a toxic condition. And a process of vicarious elimination had been instituted to get rid of the excess load. And this thing they called a cold. Now, of course, the cold is due to virus. It certainly is, in the original meaning of the word virus. It's due to a toxic state. How do you get rid of a cold? Well, inasmuch as a cold is a process of vicarious elimination, you don't want to get rid of it. You want to let it run its course. You want to let it finish its task. And then it automatically ceases to exist, just like it automatically came into existence when there was a need for it. You just don't have to treat it. You just don't have to cure it. So you don't need any therapeutic devices or anything. You can get well of your cold by just going on about your business and doing nothing. But you can get well much quicker if you facilitate the eliminating process by rest, by warmth, and by fasting. Now, you can get well of a cold while you're driving across the continent from New York to San Francisco in the wintertime and being chilled and eating 3 meals a day and driving long hours and not get any sleep. But it may take you 2 or 3 weeks to do it. Whereas you can get rid of your cold or get well of your cold in 2, 3, and 4 days by going to bed and resting, by fasting and by keeping warm, and by drinking only as much water as thirsty man. The idea that because you've got a cold you should push fluids, drink a lot of water and a lot of soup and a lot of juices, is a false idea. What you need to do is simply to rest, drink only what thirsty man, and eat nothing. A cold is an acute catarrhal condition. Chronic catarrh of the nose and throat is the same kind of a condition, except it's lasting rather than more severe and ends in a few days. But we frequently have several colds before we develop a chronic catarrhal condition. In other words, the acute stage is only the initial beginnings of what turns out to be a chronic catarrh. And chronic catarrh, well, it may go on to several different conditions, to hay fever, to asthma, to bronchitis, to sinus trouble, to ozema, or even to tuberculosis. Now, if we prevent the colds by preventing the need for them, and if we remedy the colds by a rational program of care, then we don't evolve these more serious types of trouble. We can get well of the cold by simple processes, and at the same time improve our general health, so that we come out of it in better condition than we entered it. In the summer of 1960, a man boarded the plane here in Chicago for San Antonio. He had suffered with asthma for 13 years. He had been hospitalized 3 times during that 13-year period. The last time, just before he took the plane for San Antonio. He got out of the hospital, went to the plane, and came to San Antonio. Besides asthma, he was deaf in the left ear, had been for some 6 years. He had enlarged prostate. He had sinus trouble, sinus infection they like to call it. It's just a catarrhal condition. And a few other troubles, minor ones. So I put him on a fast. He came in the afternoon. I told him, now, I'm not going to do anything to relieve your suffering. And you're not going to take any more drugs. So we took his drugs away from him. Well, he was in the same room with another fellow from St. Louis. And around 4 o'clock in the morning, the man from St. Louis called me on the intercom, and he said, this man is suffering very much. I think you ought to come up and see him. So I went up to see him, and I've seen asthmatics suffer a lot worse. So I talked with him a few minutes, and I said, now, it's going to take you about 24 hours to get free of this paroxysm, and then you're not going to have any more of it. In the meantime, relax as much as you can and get what rest you can. So I went on back to bed. He said to the man from St. Louis, what kind of a place have I come to? They won't even relieve my trouble. He was ready to go home. But what could he do at home? He had tried everything they could throw at him in 13 years. In about an hour he relaxed and went back to sleep. On the 25th day of his fast, he says, I want to break my fast. I have a lot of patients that think they are the doctor. I sometimes call them, well, now, Dr. Jones, we'll carry out your instructions, but give us the reason for them, or something like that. At any rate, I said, you're not ready to break your fast. You need to go considerably longer. Now, let's go on and get results while we're... But I feel all right. I have no trouble. I said, you're not well. And unless you get well, a few extra meals and you'll be suffering again. Okay, he'd go on. On the 36th day of his fast, his hearing was restored. Now, if we had broken his fast on the 25th day, he probably would not have regained hearing in that left ear. He fasted a total of 42 days. He got rid of his enlarged prostate. He got rid of the enlargement. He still had the prostate. He got rid of his sinus trouble. He regained his hearing. And he was freed of his asthma. So, everything was lovely. Now he says, I'm going to stick to this program. I'm not going to have any more trouble. So last year he came back again. He had asthma. I said, what have you been doing? Well, I've been sticking pretty well to your program. I said, you have? How much beer did you drink? Well, he said, I didn't drink much. I took 1 or 2 bottles a day. I said, how well did you stick to the diet? I ate just what you told me. And I said, well, now, how close did you stick to the quantity? Well, pretty close, and I found out from his wife that he hadn't. So we gave him another fast. He didn't, the asthma is the only thing he had that had recurred. He still had good hearing in the ear, still wasn't having any trouble with his prostate, but he did have the recurrence of asthma. So we gave him another fast. He hasn't been back since, so I assume that second time taught him a lesson. But this is what I would like to emphasize. There isn't any reason for one having to come back a second time. I cared for a young man in New York a number of years ago. He came to me and he said, I have been to physicians, hospitals, osteopaths, and this and that, and I've come here now as a last resort. If you can't help me, I guess I'm done for. Well, I didn't think he was so very ill. And my judgment isn't always as good as it sounds, because I'll tell you another story in a minute to explain why. I took him under my care, and in a few weeks I discharged him in excellent condition. About a year later he came in, and he was just about in the same condition he was when he came in the first time. He says, Dr. Shelton, you're going to have to do your job all over again. I said, why? Well, he said, I'm back where I was. I said, why? You know how it is. I said, no, I don't know how it is. How is it? Well, when I was coming to you, he said I was living alone and I could do what I wanted to do. But shortly after you discharged me, I moved into the home of my sister. And we sit around in the evening playing checkers and playing cards. And they smoke and they take their coffee and they eat their cookies. And they said to me, oh, come on, have one cigarette. One isn't going to hurt you. And I took one. And then I took another. And now I'm smoking more than I ever did. And they said, have 1 cup of coffee. 1 cup of coffee never hurt anybody. So I took that first cup of coffee. And now I'm drinking coffee regularly and heavily. And the same with the cookies and the other things. Well, you know the old Chinese proverb that a 1,000-mile journey begins with the first step? Drug addiction begins with the first step. The coffee habit, the cigarette habit, the cookie habit, they all come in through that first step. If you don't take the first step, you can't take the second one. It isn't like that $1 million, that if you don't make the first million, you can start on the second million, but you can't do that with the habit. So I took him in charge, and after a few weeks, I discharged him again, and I said to him when I did it the second time, I said, now don't come back to me a third time. If you go home and make yourself sick again, you know better, you know how to say well, don't you come back, because I'm not going to do anything for you. I never saw him afterwards. I don't know what he did. I'd almost bet that he didn't do what he should. I had another man came in to me. I'll tell you this to show you how poor my judgment is. He came in. I looked him over very carefully and got his case history. He couldn't speak English. He was Greek. And my Greek is all Chinese, so we had to use an interpreter. Through the interpreter, he asked me, how much will you take, paid cash in advance, to take care of me until I'm well? Now, that's not fair to anybody. It isn't fair to the patient. It isn't fair to the doctor. But I figured out that it was going to take about so long for him to get well. 6 weeks, I think I figured, or 7 weeks. I figured that normally 6 or 7 weeks I would get, or his office called, so much. So I multiplied it by 2, and I said, I'll take care of you until you get well for that amount. Now remember, I figured 6 or 7 weeks. After he'd been coming to me for a week or 2 or 10 days or something of the kind, the interpreter informed me that the medical profession had said that he couldn't possibly get well. He was going to be dead in 6 weeks. It took me 9 months to get that man into a satisfactory condition. Well, I had made a deal, so I stuck with it. But it shows you how poor our judgment is sometimes. It shows also how poor the medical man's judgment is. They had him dead in 6 weeks, and I had him well in 6 weeks, and it took me 9 months instead. Now, all of these things are accomplished by simple means. Came down to my place a few years ago from Chicago. Well, from one of the suburbs of Chicago. A physician, a medical man. He was up in years. He wrote me and he said he had cancer of the lungs. Now, I can't do anything for cancer of the lungs, and neither can anybody else. And I wrote him that I couldn't do anything for him. But before he got my letter, he took the plane and came on down. And he wired me that he was going to arrive at such and such a time, and would I please meet him? Well, I met him at the plane, and he came out of the plane with a young man that he brought along with him, supporting him and holding him up. Now, what do you think I saw as one of the first things that struck my eyes? A man coming down that walkway, or gangplank we'll call it, suffering with the last stages of cancer of the lungs, smoking a cigarette. So weak he could hardly walk, but still smoking. We set him down on a bench, and I got my car and brought it around on the landing field and picked him up. And I said to him, Doctor, I'm surprised to find you still smoking. Smoking doesn't cause cancer, he says. I think that is the reason most physicians still smoke. No matter how much evidence is brought forward to prove that smoking contributes to the production of cancer of the lung, they stick with their cigarette habit. They're convinced that it doesn't cause cancer, and nobody ever said it does. But I will point out that 3 years before it was announced that they had discovered that smoking contributes to the cause of cancer, 3 years prior to that date, in an article on cancer in the Hygienic Review, I made the statement that smoking was helping to produce cancer of the lungs. I don't know whether they took their clue from my magazine article or not, but every once in a while I publish something in my magazine, and a year or two later the medical profession discovers it. It happens so often, I wonder if they don't watch my writing. Now, how do you expect to get well of any condition so long as you're deliberately doing the things that are producing and maintaining the condition, as this physician was? Well, I said, Doctor, why did you come down here? Didn't you get my letter? He said, no, I came before your letter arrived. I said, you know that I can't do anything for your cancer. You know that nothing can be done for it. He said, of course I do, but I'm grasping at straws. Well, he lived about 24 hours after arriving. Imagine taking a long trip like that, in that condition, and hoping that somebody can perform a miracle and restore you to health. The time to get these troubles is while they're simple, in the early stages. That is the real remedy for cancer, prevention. Cancer is an irreversible pathology. They aren't going to find any cures for cancer. Oh, I know they're curing 1 out of every 3 cases today. In the same way that I told you this afternoon, if the patient is still alive, although he still has cancer, 5 years after the diagnosis is made, he's counted cured. Most of these cases of so-called cured cancer are in cases of skin cancer. Well, now, you can live a long time with skin cancer, 20, 30 years. And I'm not sure that most of the cases, the conditions they diagnose as skin cancer are, because I've seen too many of them get well and remain well, whereas I've never seen a case of undoubted cancer get well. Now, many of these other cured cases are in cases that weren't cancer anyhow. For example, a number of years ago, a young man came to me with a large lump about the size of a baseball, maybe a little larger, in the lower right abdomen, right down near the groin. And I examined him, and he said, what do you think it is? And I said, I think you're suffering with adenitis. And he said, you see that scar on my abdomen? What do you think that is? Well, I said, it looked like you've had your appendix removed. No, that's where they went in to make a biopsy. And I said, well, what did they say? Giant cell sarcoma, which is one form of cancer. Well, I said, maybe they're right, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't believe it. And I know that the biopsy is not accurate. It's not always reliable. So we put the man on a fast, and in 1 short week, his sarcoma disappeared. Now, was it sarcoma? Of course not. Could I say that I remedied the case of cancer? Well, I could say it, but I'd be lying. And I think there's a lot of other lying going on about curing cancer. I've seen too many of these cases. I've had 2 cases to get well in 3 days. I've had them to get well in a week, in 2 weeks, in 3 weeks, in 6 weeks, of supposed cancer. Sometimes these cancers had been made, biopsies had been made, and other times no biopsy. Sometimes as many as 4 physicians had independently examined the case, and all of them had agreed that it was cancer. All of them insisted upon an early operation. In the case of the young fellow who had the adenitis, it was supposed to be a sarcoma. They had agreed that the case was inoperable. But we performed an operation that was quite successful, and the patient didn't die. Now, we did it simply by stopping the things that were producing and maintaining the condition, and by giving the man rest and physiological rest. We let the work of restoring health go on from within, because we have no means of producing health from without. I never cured anybody in all of my life, and I never expect to. I am not in the curing business. If I could cure you of your diseases, I wouldn't do it. If I could cure you of the effects of alcohol, what do you think would happen? Automatically, I would license you to drink all you want. Come back for another cure. It would be a demoralizing thing. But when I say to you that you have got to discontinue the things that are producing it, you've got to cease your violations of the laws of life if you want to get well, then I have put into your hands a moral program, not a demoralizing one, that will enable you to do for yourself, not depend upon me. If you depend on somebody to cure you, you become a slave to that somebody. You're no longer a free person. You're no longer self-reliant. You're no longer doing for yourself. A doctor is a teacher. A health school is a place where people are taught. We don't cure you. We do provide you with rest, or an opportunity for rest. We do provide you with the right kind of food. We do supervise your fasting. We provide you with sunshine, sunbathing, and various other requirements of recovery. But we don't treat you, and we don't cure you. But we do teach you, so that you learn why you got sick, why you remain sick, how you get well, and how you can stay well. And this is important. You go to a hospital, you go to a sanitarium, you go to a clinic, you stay for a few weeks or a few months. Maybe you get well, and maybe they take you out in a wooden kimono. But in either case, you leave the hospital with your mind a blank. You haven't learned any lessons. You've acquired no self-discipline. You don't know why you became ill. You don't know what's happened that you got well if you did. You don't know how to get well, how to stay well after you leave there. You learn nothing that's of any value to you in any subsequent state of health or disease. You have simply been treated or mistreated, and your mind left a blank. This is not, in my opinion, the proper way to deal with the problems of health, of disease, and of healing. Of course, it's all right for those who are running a commercial game, and I want you to keep coming back and coming back for more and coming back for more. We get enough repeats without having to try to force the matter, because too many of us, well, we say the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Sometimes I think it's the spirit that's willing and not the flesh. The spirit that's weak. We get too many people who are like that biblical sow that was washed. They return to their wallowing in the mire. They don't learn their lesson well enough the first time. Sometimes they don't learn it well enough the second time. They come back for a third time and a fourth time. I've got one man in New York that I think he's been in my place 13 times. And I say to him, well, when are you going to stop doing this? When are you going to learn to take care of yourself? Oh, he says, I can't do anything. I go back there and I have to eat in restaurants, and I live alone, and I can't do these things there. So I come down here every so often for a checkup, for a cleanup. I've got another fellow who lives down in the Rio Grande Valley. He has asthma. He comes up and he spends 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks. He's been to my place about 10 times. The last time he was there, I said, how many more times are you coming here? When are you going to learn to behave yourself? When I die. It's too late then. You're very much like the fellow that came to be hanged. And the sheriff said to him, have you any last words before I put this rope around your neck? And the fellow says, yes, this is going to be a lesson to me. He got the lesson too late. And this fellow, his lesson would come too late also, when I die. Well, we have people like that. We have them that say, I've had them say to me, I'd rather live like I do and die in 10 years than to live like you do and live 100. Well, it's a good philosophy if it works. But it doesn't work. They don't die at the end of 10 years. They spend 20 years running around grunting and groaning and a burden to themselves and their families and everybody around them. They spend their lives in hospitals and sanitariums and clinics and chasing climates and chasing cures. If only they die, it would be all right. But the process of dying is so slow and so painful and so expensive that really it really doesn't pay to die that way. It pays to live better and to enjoy life. But they think they're enjoying life if they can dope themselves. Yes, one girl said to me, apparently a very intelligent girl, she was holding down a very responsible job on a newspaper. She had a department in that newspaper. Her articles were appearing daily in the newspaper. You'd think she was intelligent. She said, why should I give any attention to my diet? If I get anything wrong with me, I'll take a pill. Now, is that a mark of intelligence? Why should I make any effort to avoid getting sick? If I get sick, I'll take a pill. As though a pill can just erase all the effects of the abuses that we have been heaping upon ourselves. I heard a radio lecturer once. I didn't hear this on the radio. He didn't say this on the radio. I heard him. He was attending one of my lectures in New York City. He was selling a product over the air that he manufactured. You could guess who it was if I tell you that he always had the people to spell it backwards. I suggested that it would be better to smell it backwards. But at any rate, here he was, fat, with his neck running down over the outside of his collar and hanging down, collar tight, face and neck very red. And one of my students said to him, Doctor, why don't you take care of yourself? Why don't you try to maintain good health? Oh, he says, if I get sick, I'll go on a fast. Now, I say that's stupid. Not to go on a fast, but to get sick when you know how to stay well. And it's equally stupid not to learn how to stay well when the opportunity is offered. Our parents and our grandparents were ignorant. And they had no means of finding out how to take care of themselves. They didn't have any place to go to learn. But that's no longer true. Today, if we remain ignorant, it's because we prefer to be ignorant. We're willingly ignorant. A man came to me once. He says, I've got heart disease. I've been up to such and such a clinic, and I spent a week there, and they charged me so many dollars. And they gave me instructions to take back to my physician for him to take care of me. And he's been caring for me for some time according to those instructions. And I'm not getting any better. And I'm tired of these horse doctors. Can you do anything for me? So I examined his heart. I said, there isn't anything wrong with your heart. They wouldn't let him perform any activity. He was an accountant for an oil company. He was way down on the Rio Grande border, in one of these little oil towns, living in a little oil shack. From the office where he worked to the little hut in which he lived was about a city block. Walking to and from the office and his home twice a day was all the physical activity they permitted him to engage in, because his heart was in very bad condition. And they were giving him drugs. So after examining him at rest, I had him to do some squats, 10 of them. I examined his heart again. I said, your heart's fine. But I have rapid heart every once in a while. It just races. And I said, in those cases, on those times, do you find you're full of gas? I'm full of gas all the time, he said. I said, do you have more gas at that time? Yes, I do. But there's your trouble. It's pressure on the heart that's causing your racing heart. There's nothing wrong with your heart. So I gave him instructions to carry out. I changed his diet completely. I stopped him from smoking. And I gave him some exercise to take daily. They said, don't do any exercise. I gave him some strenuous exercise. In a month's time, you wouldn't know the man. He had lost all thought that he had heart trouble. He had gained several pounds. He was feeling so good that it was a joy to live again. Well, now this young fella, he told me very frankly, he said, "I thought you were just a quack." Now a quack, the man who poisons his patients with quacksalver. Which is the German for quicksilver or mercury. And I never gave a dose of it in my life. So this young fellow had had 3 years medical training. And due to the death of his father, he didn't get to finish the last year. So he hobnobbed with the physician. His wife, before they were married, worked for me one summer as a typist. And down there in the far reaches of the valley, she developed urticaria, the giant-sized type. And she was cared for by the physicians down there, and she kept getting worse. Finally, she said to her husband one day, she says, "Ted, I'm through with these horse doctors. You can say whatever you want to or do whatever you want to. I'm going to Dr. Shelton." So he brought her up. In a week's time, she was free of a condition that she'd been suffering with under their care for several months. And she remained free of it. And he said to me, "When I saw what you did for my wife, I changed my mind. Now when he saw what I did for him, he changed his mind still more, but not enough." He went to school, he went into practice, but he got to drinking. Oh, well, I've seen a lot of fellows kill themselves with drink that might have lived for many years. And he did. I've known a number of people who knew better who went to drinking. I remember shortly after I moved to San Antonio, I met a young chiropractor. He wasn't doing any good. He had a few patients. He was eking out a miserable existence, but he wasn't doing any good. Then a little child was bounced out of a rumble seat, going into a dip, fell on her head on the pavement. She was rushed to the hospital. 3 or 4 days in the hospital, and she was still unconscious. So the parents took her out, put her in the hands of this chiropractor. He gave her an adjustment or two, and she regained consciousness. So the newspapers played it up big. And before you knew it, he had more business than he could take care of. He was doing a land office business, making lots of money. It went to his head. He bought a Cadillac. He bought a new home. He started spending money liberally. He started going to this thing and that thing and the other, and he began to drink. 3 years later, he hits me up on the street for a dime to get a cup of coffee. Now, he knew better, or should have, but they do those things, in spite of the fact that you think, at least, that they know better. Now, this is something that we have to contend with in this crazy civilization of ours. Everything in it, every influence in it, pulls us in the wrong direction. We foster weakness. We foster disease. We foster crime. If we didn't have crime in this country, think of all this, the hundreds of thousands of policemen and of judges and of guards in the prisons and of court attendants that would be thrown out of work. And as most of the policemen and most of the guards in the prisons are Irishmen, I think crime is largely an Irish racket. If there are any Irishmen here, I'll remind you that I'm half Irish myself. But we foster these things. We foster the conditions that breed crime, that breed weakness, that breed disease. And we resent and resist every effort that is made to change those conditions, to bring about different conditions, conditions that foster strength and vigor and health and good morals. And inasmuch as this is the kind of civilization we live in, it means that we've got to be always on our guard. I get letter after letter, and I got questions here. I didn't get to answer all the questions this afternoon. We had so many questions I would have had to stay here a week to answer them all. But many of them ask me about things. What do I think of this product and of that product? And would I recommend this and would I recommend that? They've been reading the advertising that is written to sell the stuff. And an ad writer who can't write a very convincing ad just doesn't keep his job very long. The best thing for you to do is to stay away from the advertising and stay away from the salesman. The man who is a good salesman is a convincing talker. And he always has his facts, as he calls them, right at the tip of his tongue. Don't listen to the advertising and to this talk of the salesman, and don't read the advertising, and you won't be so often misled. I have said repeatedly that if you tell me what a man says and what he does, I'll tell you what he thinks. He thinks in his own interest always. He's got something to sell. He makes up a talk or he writes up an ad that he thinks will sell it. And it doesn't have to be true. We've got to battle with these things all the time because we're being continuously brainwashed in every possible way from every possible direction. And if we're not on our guards, we're going to find ourselves buying, taking, using substances, products that have absolutely no value whatsoever. I go into one of the health food stores down there in San Antonio where I buy certain types of fruits, dried fruits, and a few other items, and I look over their shelves and I say to the proprietor, I started to say promoter, how much longer do you think you're going to run this store before they put you under the pharmacy regulations? They got more drugs in these health food stores than they have in the drugstores. They got reducing substances. They're even selling coffee in them nowadays. Of course, you know, it's health coffee. They sell candy, health candy, chocolate, some of it, but it's all health chocolate. They got special breads for diabetics and others. They got special foods for special troubles, but they really have plenty of vitamins. Now, you go into a health food store, and lo and behold, here is a man or a woman running a store. Sometimes they went through high school, and sometimes they stopped before they finished high school. They had no training, and yet they're standing there day after day, hour after hour, prescribing for patients, telling them what vitamin they need, which minerals they are lacking in, and how do they know? What tests do they make to determine? They know only what they've learned in the advertising and material that comes to them from the manufacturer. I remember one day I was in there and the lady was telling a man what to do for his arthritis, which vitamins to take, which minerals he needed. And when he went out, I said, how do you know that man has arthritis? Well, he said he did. There's a legitimate place in this crazy world of ours right now for the health food store. As a matter of fact, the world's first health food store was started by a group of hygienists in Boston in 1836. And we still have a need for them. And they still sell a number of things that are useful. But they sell so many things that we ought to dump into the wastebasket. And these are the things they're stressing, because these are the things they're making most money out of. And we have to be on guard all the time to keep ourselves from being sold a bill of goods that we have no earthly need for. There's nothing mysterious about living right. There's nothing that you have to have a university education to understand. There is nothing that you can't teach to your children and make them understand. But you've got to guard those children continually. You send them to school, and the school teacher says, you've got to have meat. You can't live without it. No other food has all the amino acids you need. Now, your school teacher doesn't even know what an amino acid is. If you ask her to tell you what are the essential and what are the non-essential amino acids, she wouldn't be able to name them. But the packing industry has told her that meat alone contains all of the needed amino acids. Now, do you know how you get all the needed amino acids out of flesh foods? You know how you can do it? You have to eat the whole animal. Here you are eating muscle and fat and imagining that you're getting all the needed amino acids. It's not there. The only way to get an adequate diet on a flesh diet is to eat the entire animal, the blood, the entrails, the liver, the kidneys, the brain, and part of the bone. And even then you may fail. Most of the carnivorous animals that you think live on an exclusive flesh diet supplement their diet with berries and fruits and vegetables at various times during the year. This has been known for a long time, that in order to get all the needed amino acids, you have to eat the whole animal. Why? Because every particular part of the body, the blood, the liver, the heart, the muscles, and so on, has its own specific type of protein. And none of those proteins supply all of the amino acids that you need. So you've got to have more than one of those animal proteins to get all of the amino acids. But the teacher says you must have flesh. And she says nuts don't supply all the needed amino acids. Recently, I had occasion to supply a teacher with information to the contrary. She says, oh, I knew that all the time. Of course she didn't. And she had been telling the children that nuts don't contain the needed amino acids, and they don't have enough protein. And we showed her that most nuts contain more protein than most flesh foods. Oh, she knew that too. But she had been telling the children differently anyhow. She had been telling what she had been told to tell. I'd hate to be a school teacher. I remember having a school teacher down there as a patient some years ago. She was a Jehovah's Witness. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses make a great fuss about truth. They insist on telling the truth. And I said to her, I don't understand how you reconcile your work as a school teacher with your religion. She said, I don't understand what you mean. I said, how do you teach school and conform to your demand that you tell the truth? Oh, she says, that's the reason I teach mathematics. Any school teacher who dares to tell the truth will be thrown out on her ear before she gets very far. Now remember one. He was in a section where they didn't have compulsory vaccination, but they tried to coerce everybody into being vaccinated anyhow. So they gave all the school teachers slips to give out among the students with the instructions to have the students take them home and have their parents to sign them. The signing was permission to vaccinate the children, or the child. So this particular teacher handed out the slips that she was required to do, and she said to the students, if you take my advice, you'll tell your parents not to sign them. The next morning, one of her students came in with a signed slip, and all the rest of them came in without the slip signed. This was a dead giveaway. Something happened in this room. All the other children in all the other rooms came in with their slip signed. So they investigated, and they discovered that this teacher had told these children not to have the slip signed. So what do you think happened to her? Before you knew it, she was teaching music in a private studio of her own. Now, the great object of education is to teach you to think, or at least that's what they say. But if you dare think, you know what happens to you? They grade you down. You've got to accept, not think. You have to memorize. You have to take what the teacher says and what the textbook says, and you must accept it as gospel truth. And if you dare question it, if you deny it, if you doubt it, well, you're graded down. If you get into some of the so-called institutions of higher learning, They do it a little differently. They not only grade you down, they get you out. Don't think, accept. That's education. Why must you accept? Because our socio-economic structure is afraid of the thinker. It is afraid to have people analyze it and to think about it and think it through and see what it is. The medical profession doesn't want you to think. The theological professions don't want you to think. Why don't they want you to think? Well, you might see through and understand what they're telling you. And you might understand how false it all is. Now, right now we're in a condition that is developing very rapidly in this country, and we must be ready to meet it. Today we see people all over the country in increasing numbers who are beginning to doubt the infallibility of the medical profession. A man said to me only recently, and I was surprised when he said it, because this man was very conventional in his thinking. He had never questioned anything that was accepted. He conformed in every particular. He says, "What do you think of allergy?" Allergy, I said, is like heredity. It is a peg on which we hang all of our ignorance. If we don't know the cause of a thing, we say, "You got an allergy." He says, "That's what I'm beginning to think." He says, "I got a little grandchild, and we're having a lot of trouble with it. First, they put it on cow's milk. First, it was allergic to its mother's milk, so we put it on cow's milk. It was allergic to cow's milk, so we put it on goat milk. It's allergic to goat's milk, so they've tried formulas, and it's allergic to this formula and that formula." He says, "It seems to be allergic to everything." He said, "When I grew up, we never heard about allergy, and everybody drank milk. Mothers didn't have trouble nursing their babies. What's wrong with us?" And he's beginning to think. Now, this is only one example. It's going on all over the country. Many thousands of people are beginning to doubt. They're beginning to question. And they're developing fears. Mr. Prorock read you here this afternoon from now you don't need to help bring it up here, from the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal carries frequent articles about what's going on in the manufacturing drug business. But he read you an article of a drug that had been withdrawn from the market because of its very damaging side effects. Now, there never was a drug, from Hippocrates to the present, that didn't produce these so-called side effects. And some of them have been very deadly. He read this to you. The side effects were sufficiently bad that it's being withdrawn from the market. This thing happens so frequently today. They're using such powerful drugs, and the side effects are so marked and so damaging that drug after drug has been withdrawn from the market. They don't all get into the newspapers. Every so often, some pharmacist or some druggist sends me a letter sent out to the druggists and the pharmacists of the country, notifying these people that they're withdrawing a certain drug from the market because of its untoward side effects, and telling why they're withdrawing it. And they send me these letters so that I can make use of them in my writing. Oh yes, the druggists themselves are getting skeptical. Of course, many of them have been skeptical for a long time. A president of the American Pharmaceutical Society once said to me in New York City, he said, "Someday I'd like to sit down with you and really tell you some ghost stories about the drug business, some hair-raising ones." He says, "I have been president of the association and I've been a druggist long enough. I know, and I can tell you." So they've known for a long time, but it's a good racket. You know the story, I'm sure, of the deaf man who went into the drugstore to buy a drug, and the man told him the price was 75 cents. So he couldn't hear well, so he put down a nickel on the counter. And the druggist said, "I said 75 cents. He says, "There's your 5 cents. No, he said 75 cents. "Well, there's your 5 cents. So he started out, And the druggist says, "Oh, go on, I made 3 cents on the deal anyhow." It's worse than that. The Kefauver, I told one of the columnists in one of our local newspapers who didn't like the idea of the Kefauver investigation of the drug industry, and he said so in his press. He was saying so because the owner of the newspaper was a medical man. I said, you'll find that they're getting as much as 10,000% profit on some of these drugs when this investigation gets going. Well, it turned out that they showed they were getting sometimes more than 15,000% profit. And that's better than 3 cents on a 5-cent deal. Why do they keep flooding the market with new drugs and new drugs and more drugs and more drugs? And they've got armies of so-called scientists searching the world for sources for new drugs. I saw an ad the other day. I believe it was in the U.S. News and World Report. An ad by one of the pharmaceutical houses telling that they had men searching through garbage heaps, manure piles, washings up from the sea, and other places of that kind, searching all over the world for new sources of antibiotics, new antibiotics that they haven't found yet, that they can remedy the diseases that the present antibiotics won't remedy. What are they searching for? More poison. What does antibiotic mean? Opposed to life. They borrowed the term from hygienists. They give a certain medical man in this country credit for having coined the word antibiotic. And I can show you the word in hygienic writings frequently that were written 20 and more years before this man is supposed to have coined the word. They borrowed it. It means opposed to life. Only we use the term not merely with reference to a drug, but when we said that things were antibiotic, we discussed any kind of condition or circumstance that might be opposed to life. For those substances that were opposed to life, we use the term antivital, which means exactly the same thing. Bios is the Greek word for life, vital is the Latin word for life, antivital, antibiotic, it's all the same. But we use the two terms for the two different types of conditions. And they're still looking for poison. Now, I told you a while ago, this afternoon rather, that one of the old aphorisms of medicine, as they expressed it in Latin, was ubi virus, ibi virtus. Where there is poison, there is virtue. Well, that was the idea. In the last century, it was stated by a leading medical authority in this country, in a work on materia medica and therapeutics, that we find our best and most potent remedies among the most powerful poisons. Another man, an authority in the medical field in this country, made the statement that our strongest poisons are our best remedies. A few years ago, a science writer in the New York Times made the statement that if a substance is not poisonous, it is not supposed to have any medicinal value. Only about 3 weeks ago in Time, a similar statement was made. If it is not poisonous, it has no medicinal value. Now, isn't this a stupid idea that if it won't kill you, it also won't cure you? If it won't make you sick, it can't possibly make you well. We get well by using helpful things, not by using hurtful things, not by using the disease-producing things. We save life not by giving something to kill the patient. It's something like finding a man drowning and he's going down for the third time, so you put your foot on his head and shove him in a little faster. It's a ridiculous idea, but it's a medical idea that has been fostered for a long time. And why? The idea was originally formed that to cure disease, you had to produce disease. Now, they had two ideas about that. One school of medicine had its law of cure expressed contrary cure. No, I can't think of it. Anyhow, translated into English, it means contrary is cure opposite. or we cure one disease by producing an opposite disease. Another school came along and said, no, that's wrong. The law of cure is express simile a similibus curantur, which means like cures like. Now what do? Instead of producing an opposite disease, they produce a similar disease. Both of them, in order to produce disease, had to have disease-producing agents. One of them, if you had diarrhea, they'd give you a drug to produce diarrhea, to cure diarrhea. Or if you had constipation, he'd give you a drug to produce constipation in order to cure constipation. Now, the other fellow, on the other hand, if you had constipation, he'd give you a drug to produce diarrhea. If you had diarrhea, he'd give you something to check the diarrhea and make you constipated. But they produced one disease to cure another. Similar or opposite, it didn't make any difference. It was still another disease. A drug disease to cure the so-called natural disease. They had to have disease-producing agents to produce these diseases. So they had to have poison. And while they no longer talk about these laws of cures, whether they're to produce one disease, a similar disease or an opposite disease, they no longer talk about it, they no longer stress it. They practice just as if the so-called laws of cure are still realities to them. They're still producing disease. And the newspapers are full of it. They call them side effects. They call them untoward effects. They call them allergies. You die of poisoning, and it's because you were allergic to the poison. You shouldn't have been allergic. You'd have been all right. Imagine a gunman saying to the judge, "Judge, it wasn't my fault. He was allergic to lead poisoning." If he hadn't been allergic to lead poisoning, my bullet wouldn't have killed him. And imagine him getting away with it like the medical profession. You're allergic. Give you a dose of powerful poison and you die, and it's because you're allergic. Give you a dose of that same poison and you develop so-called side effects, and you're allergic. Yes, I said a minute ago that allergy is a peg on which we hang our etiological ignorance. If we don't know the cause, well, it's allergy. But the thing has been used as a scapegoat for failure so long that people are beginning to see through it. It's wearing thin. And they're beginning to question it. And they're beginning to doubt the fallibility of a profession that after 2,500 years can't even remedy a common cold.